recording the conversation. So if you have to leave early, then you can watch it later. Or if you just want to watch it later, it'll be in the mentor chat in a little bit. So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Okay, so two things. First of all, I will insist that there's time for questions at the end, because that's sort of, I find it more interesting. You might as well, if I don't just lecture at you. I will often find the question period to be much more interesting than the rest of it. And also, just remind me, how long do we have?
Until 3 p.m. Eastern time, 1 hour.
Okay, and the other question is, so you want me to talk, she told me all this before, everybody, but you know, my brain doesn't retain a lot. You want me to talk a bit about the career thing, and then?
Yeah, I would say give us a little bit of your background, kind of how you got to where you are, what you think is most interesting about that, and then into how to pitch an editor. And most of our community is graduate students in the sciences, so okay. They don't have a lot of experience with pitching an editor.
Okay, great. All right, so what's interesting about my career, at least it's interesting to me, is that I deluded myself for a great deal of my early life into thinking I was going to be a scientist. And that's because, thanks to my father, who was not only a physicist at Princeton University, but a gifted explainer and teacher of science to people at all levels of comprehension. So he could give a graduate seminar, he could teach undergraduates, he could talk to high school kids, he could talk to middle school kids, he could talk to insurance brokers, he could talk to anybody and get them excited about science, just because he was so passionate about it and he was so good at explaining it. So as a child, I was exposed to that all the time. He would tell me stories about the universe and the planets and the stars and subatomic world and all this great stuff. And he made it sound so exciting that I said, this is what I want to be when I grow up. And so that's what I plan to do all through high school. And what should have given me a clue that this wasn't necessarily the best plan was that I hated every science course I ever took. I hated every aspect of it. I hated the textbooks. I hated the lectures. I hated the lab exercises. I didn't particularly enjoy doing a lot of math. The precision involved in making measurements, valid measurements, it was all really, really annoying. And that's because I was introduced to science through the kind of storytelling you do with a kid. You know, you don't make them do problem sets. You tell them stories about the universe. But I thought that, you know, this is a story about serious lack of self-knowledge. At the same time that I was hating my science courses, I really liked my courses where I was doing writing. And I was told that I was pretty good at it. And I thought, oh, well, that's very nice, you know, but so what? You know, what does that have to do with anything? Because I'm going to be a scientist. So I got to college and I signed up to major in astrophysics. If we have any astrophysicists out there, you might be amused by this especially. And I had to take the introductory physics course, the one for science majors. And I somehow thought that when I got to college, we would get to the awe-inspiring part, you know, that I would be sitting in my lectures learning about the quasars shining at the edge of the universe, which had only recently been discovered at that point. And you know, the birth of galaxies and supernovas and comets and all this just exciting stuff going on out in the universe. We were also, the first moon landing was 2 years before I went into college. So, I mean, there was all this great stuff to learn about, but we didn't do any of that. We just did more of what I did in high school, except it was much harder. And there was much more math, and awe and wonder was nowhere on the horizon. And the whole thing came to a crashing end at the end of the first semester of that physics course, where I got a D plus, because, or maybe it was just a D, or maybe it was a D minus. Anyway, it was a grade that basically said, you learned nothing, but we don't want to fail you because that's mean. And that was the universe giving me a sign that I was not perhaps cut out to be a scientist. The problem was, oh, and my father, the physicist, was really happy to see that grade, because in those days, your parents got your grades from the college. So I couldn't hide it. So that was a sign I had to do something else. The problem was I had no idea what else I wanted to do. Truly no clue. So I had to major in something. By now it's the end of my sophomore year of college. And I thought, well, economics, that's a hot field. And it's sort of like science-ish. And maybe I should try that. Okay, I signed up to major in economics. I had never taken a course in it. So we're talking about ignorance about who I was and what I should be doing, raised to another exponent. And I started taking those economics courses, and darned if I didn't dislike that as well. And at this point, my thought was, just let me get out of here. Let me graduate, and I'll figure out what comes next. So I stuck it out, and I got a degree with dubious honors, that is, no honors, in economics. And the day after I took my last final exam, I stopped thinking about it and have never thought about it since in a serious way. I wasn't qualified to be an economist. If I'd wanted to go to graduate school, I couldn't have gotten any professor to write me a recommendation, because I used to hide in the back and not talk to anybody. Anyway, things were a little, how shall I say, depressing at that moment, because I had no prospect for life. Well, and I promise you, this is going to become less depressing very shortly. But it took me a few years to finally realize that I didn't want to do what a scientist does. That's just, for me, really unpleasant. I wanted to know what a scientist knows. And I finally realized, and again, this took a long time, that the best way to do that is not to start with, Isaac Newton or whoever, and work your way up to the modern age bit by bit. It's simply to ask a scientist, what do you know, and how do you know it, and why do you care, and why should I care, and what excites you, and all that kind of stuff. How did you discover this? How hard was it? Did you have any false starts? I wanted to know the stories. And along about that time, and Joe, I think, will remember that, we're now in the late 1970s, and science journalism and science writing had not really been a very prominent field until about then. And so I didn't, if it had been, maybe I would have read Discover magazine and said, oh, I want to do this, but it didn't exist. But in the late 70s, a number of science magazines were founded pretty much all at once, including Discover and a couple others that didn't last. The AAAS actually had a popular science magazine for a number of years in the early 80s. But they all, most of them went out of business. But for a few years there, science journalism, science writing, talking about the newest, most by definition the newest, because nobody's going to write an article about the oldest, the newest discoveries and what they meant and how we could understand the universe better, and how we were doing it and so on. The magazines were full of that stuff. And the New York Times began its Science Times section at the same time. The Washington Post and the Boston Globe followed suit. I think the Chicago Tribune had a science section. Suddenly it was everywhere. And I read this stuff and I said, this is great. I love reading this. And the light finally went off. Hey, they told you you're good at writing. and this is science the way you love to learn about it. Maybe you could do this for a living. So I knocked on a bunch of doors, and people let me in because I had a college degree and I had some connections, and they said, and I said, I want to write about science for you. I want to write for your magazine. Or I remember I also went to the NewsHour, PBS NewsHour. I met somebody there from, I'm not sure how, and they said, yeah, okay, so do you have a degree in science? I said, well, no. But have you done science journalism? No. Have you done any journalism? No, never. Did you take any courses in journalism? No, never did that. And basically they said, okay, that's great. Go away now. You're very nice, but we're never going to hire you if you have nothing but your own enthusiasm to show us. And so I was kind of discouraged, but I went away and got a graduate degree from Columbia in journalism, focusing on science. And so now we're at Plan C, I think. And thank goodness that one worked out, because I have no idea what I would have done otherwise. I went to Columbia. I was given the confidence that I was somewhat competent at this, or at least I showed promise. And I immediately, on graduation, I had a network, a network of people who had gone to Columbia, went out into the world, and were doing science journalism. And so, you call one of them up and they say, oh, Columbia, oh, of course, come on in and see us. And I managed to get a job at a magazine called Science Digest, which was one of those magazines that kind of arose at that time, or was reborn at that time in that case. Wasn't that great a magazine, but it gave me enormous experience. And I went, after 3 years there, there was an opening at Time magazine, and I managed to get the job of the science writer at Time, which was kind of mind-blowing. And I stayed there for 20 years. And then I've done other things since, and done a lot of freelance work, written some books, done some teaching. And I ended up 4 years ago at Scientific American, where I am, I'm not just the opinion editor, I am the chief opinion editor. So that's quite a title. I'm also the only opinion editor. So I tell myself what to do, and then I complain about my boss. But so that's what I do, and that's why I'm here, because the kind of thing I do is to solicit and publish op-ed style essays, mostly by people in the sciences at every level. From, I've had a few undergrads, a lot of graduate students and postdocs, and then people all the way up to Nobel Prize winners writing essays for me on every conceivable aspect of science, and not just the facts and the discoveries and latest results, but all the experience of doing science, what it's like to be a scientist, and what are the things that the public probably doesn't know, and would be interested in knowing. And I've published a number of essays from your group, I guess. I don't know if I've done any from anyone who's online at the moment, although I did see a familiar name in the list somewhere. Okay, so that's the career. Is that good? Questions at this point? If anyone has them, I am happy. Otherwise, I will keep talking. Joe has a finger raised.
Yeah, I think, oh, Joe has a finger raised. Joe, do you have a question?
Oh, it's just funny that I had an assignment from Science Digest, and I wrote the article, and then I got paid for it, but the magazine folded before it ever got published.
Right. So in fact, the magazine, so I left the magazine to go to Time. Is this correct? Yeah, I left the magazine about a month or two before it folded. I was one of the rats who deserted the sinking ship. The signs were everywhere that we were going down the drain, because at one point the receptionist quit and they replaced her with an answering machine. It should have been a sign. But it didn't attract a lot of advertising. It was inferior to Discover and to the AAAS magazine, and it was just unfortunate, but it was a great training ground, and it gave me some visibility to the science editor at Time, who happened to look at other science magazines and had noticed my work, and this is crazy, but I happened to write about the subjects he was most interested in. So he loved astronomy. I wrote some about paleontology. He loved paleontology. I wrote about physics. So these were the things that were personally of interest to this one person. And if he had been, loved biology or something else that I didn't, genetics, which I don't even understand, I wouldn't have gotten the job, almost certainly.
So I think we have one question from Karen, and so I'll let her unmute herself and jump in, and then after that we'll jump into how to pitch an editor.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm Karen. I'm a chemistry PhD student at Columbia. I have a quick question. You mentioned an op-ed style essay. What's the difference between the op-ed style essay and just op-ed?
I say it that way. There's no difference. I say it that way because some people might not be familiar with the term, although I guess there are very few.
Okay.
Yeah, no, there's no difference.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I should talk about how to pitch an editor. I can talk mostly about how to pitch me, and I think it's pretty generally applicable to other editors. If you're talking about a reported story, so where you go out and interview people and write a news story or a feature story, that's a little bit different from what I do. So I will talk mainly about these essays that I publish. So the way to pitch me, I'll tell you that what I'm looking for is essays that talk either about your own personal experience as a scientist, and there has to be something surprising or insightful or something other than I'm going to tell you about the latest discovery in whatever in CRISPR or something like that, because pretty much anybody who is a journalist could do something like that. What I am interested in is things that are talking about the experience, your experience of being in a particular field, how you think about science. I have how you think about your own career, some experience that you had. So doing field work is a really is a pretty good way to get me interested. If you're going to tell me what it's like to be on top of a mountain, nearly blown off by the wind gusts as you're trying to, take the temperature of the glacier or something like that, that kind of vivid in-person description of what it's actually like to do what you do, and why you do it, those are great topics. If there's some kind of controversy going on in your field, your perspective as somebody who's not particularly senior, but who is watching this go by and sort of reflecting on how it affects your understanding of your career, or whether you really want to be in this field, or how to describe it. Well, I mean, let me put it this way. A perfect op-ed that I could have written, if there were such things in those days, if I could have written an essay about what it was like to arrive as an undergraduate, having thought your whole life you were going to be an astrophysicist, and discovering that you are the last person in the world who should be an astrophysicist, and why, and what the value of really understanding your strengths and weaknesses and the things you care about, rather than blindly going through life hoping it'll all work out. That would have been a perfect essay. Maybe I should write that. I had, really the best way to get a sense of the kinds of pieces I like to publish, which is a guide to the kinds of things you should pitch, is to really look at the two sections of the blogs area at scientificamerican.com that I'm in charge of, which are the observations section, which is basically just essays on any topic in science from any angle that is going to grab people's attention, to and a section called Voices, which talks about the particular issues of interest to traditionally underrepresented groups, women, minorities, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, and their particular concerns about science, or how they navigate the process of being a scientist. So I had a great piece a number of months ago from two women who wrote me a pitch and saying, we want to write about why our disabilities make us better scientists. And just that simple one sentence description made me sit up and take notice, because that's something that's surprising to me. How could a disability make you a better scientist? I want to know more. And that is the key, both to getting readers engaged and to getting an editor engaged, because my job is to stand in for the readers. What will surprise them? What will delight them? What will infuriate them? If you talk about some issue in science where people are being treated badly, or where people are being prevented from doing their work for one reason or another. So that was a great pitch. What I want to be, I guess, thinking backwards, when readers read an essay in my sections of the magazine, I want them at the end to come away saying, wow, that's really interesting, or surprising, or infuriating, or enlightening. I didn't know that. Wow, now I know something I didn't know before. It's just really interesting to know for whatever reason. And defining that is a little more difficult than recognizing it when I see it. So when you pitch me, what I want to see is a sentence that says, I would like to write about so-and-so, and if the so-and-so can be made to, is clearly surprising, intriguing, it's the kind of thing that if you said it to somebody in an informal situation, you're sitting at a dinner party, or you're sitting on a plane next to somebody, they say, well, what do you do? Oh, I'm a graduate student in neuroscience. And the person says, oh yeah, really? What are you working on? And if your answer is, if you're saying, I'm working on the G22 receptor in the such and such brain which tests the serotonin sensitivity of they're going to glaze over and inch away from you and wish they were sitting with somebody else. It's like, I have no idea what this person is talking about. But if you're saying, oh, I'm doing experiments to see if how mice get addicted to cocaine, to try and understand how it works in humans, that's something that people say, oh, addiction is a big problem. This is somebody who's studying the brain of a mouse to see how addiction works. That is intriguing. So it should be in non-technical language. It should not be too narrow, or at least shouldn't come across as being too narrow. So what you could say is, I'm getting mice hooked on cocaine to see how their brains respond. Then the piece itself can start to talk about the particular receptor and the particular pathway and all that stuff. But if you don't have people hooked with a kind of general description of what it is that would sound intriguing to an average person who's not terrified of science, or maybe even one who is, that's an advantage. And then you say a little bit about what the piece would actually say. and you tell me who you are. And, you know, so if you say, so I got a pitch today from a guy, not a student, who said, you know, I want to write about how individual action can help save the climate. Okay, well, I actually don't believe that, but that's, you know, that's my opinion. His opinion might well be valid. And then I find out that he's a guy who installs solar panels. You know, he works for a company that installs solar panels, and he has no particular expertise in human behavior, in the much broader. This is just, he was thinking about it, and this is what he thinks. I'm not that interested. If you're going to offer me an expert opinion about something, you have to be at some level an expert. And a graduate student is absolutely an expert compared to our readers. A guy who is loosely involved in something that is related to climate change but has no particular expertise in human psychology and you know, what has worked and what has not worked in the past to get people to take action, that's of less interest. I have one example here that I consider really, really telling, because it's an example of, can I find it? I can find it, I promise. This is so I got a pitch from a graduate student, and it was awful. And here is what it said. Okay, here I am. All right, so here's the original pitch. And it says, it just starts by saying, ASMR, short for Automatic Sensory Meridian Response, is a pleasant feeling caused by certain auditory or sensory stimuli. I feel like, and my response was, okay, I'm reading a Wikipedia entry. ASMR enthusiasts call these sensations tingles or brain bubbles, which produce a sense of relaxation. Okay, but again, this is an encyclopedia entry. Common triggers include tapping sounds, hair brushing, massage, whispering, personal attention, and deliberate actions. And now I'm thinking, okay, personal attention, that sounds like it's code for something that the author doesn't actually want to say in polite company. But I don't know. And deliberate actions, that's entirely vague. It's crazy. This piece, she finishes up, explores the neuroscience and novel research behind ASMR, what is going on in the brain to produce this relaxing yet weird sensation. I was completely underwhelmed. It felt like somebody was going to give me a dry explanation of this phenomenon, and why should I care anyway? I mean, what's the significance of the phenomenon? And so I wrote back to her, and I said, I told her, okay, my response is, okay, so what? And what in the world is an ASMR enthusiast? Is it somebody who joins an ASMR club? Are you saying that people go out of their way to create this sensation? And what do personal attention and deliberate actions mean? They're completely vague. They don't add zero. They add zero information. Please don't tell me things that add zero information. And then finally I said, I think my reaction has to do with the fact that I've never experienced this, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about it. In the pitch and in the piece itself, you need to address the fact right at the beginning that many readers probably have no clue what you're talking about. Have you had this sensation? Then start by telling us about your experience. Are you an ASMR enthusiast? Tell us about that. And if you haven't and you aren't, tell us about someone who has. And so she came back with a pitch that was perfect. This was the quickest example of a turnaround I've ever seen. The revised pitch starts by saying, I first experienced the tingles while watching Bob Ross's Joy of Painting. I was deeply relaxed, almost to the point of sleep, listening to the painter's calm voice and soft brushing sounds, when an oddly pleasant, prickly sensation spread across my head and neck. It was reminiscent of the ticklish feeling one gets while cleaning their ears or using a scalp massager. A Google search confirmed I wasn't a neurological freak. and that this bubbly, relaxing feeling actually had a name. So this is a graduate student in neuroscience who first pitched me by just defining something and sort of vaguely talking about it. I was not impressed. Then she sent me a little personal essay about what this is, why, how she responded when she first heard about it. And then she went to talk about what's going on in the neuroscience of it, a complete difference. And the finished piece was wonderful. So the more vivid and relatable to normal humans, not scientists, your pitch is, the better it will be. I also got a pitch that was sort of out of left field, and immediately I said, "This is great." And I don't remember exactly how the pitch itself went, but the women wrote to me and said, "Look, I guess I don't remember if she's a grad student or a postdoc or relatively early career." She said, "I want to write an essay for your magazine that talks about an issue that women face in science that essentially nobody talks about. Women who do field research that nobody talks about. I work in the Arctic, and for a woman working in a harsh environment like that, going to the bathroom is an incredibly complicated and unpleasant process. For men, they just go behind the igloo and they're fine, but this is something that seems silly, and in the face of the kinds of roadblocks women face in science, it sounds trivial, but if you have to deal with it day after day, it's not." And I went to my supervisor and told him about it, and he just made fun of me, like it was ridiculous. And we have to be aware that the kinds of barriers women face are not all just harassment and being passed over for promotions. There are also these day-to-day things that make it harder for women to do science. And I thought, this is great. Nobody outside of the sciences, and no man in the sciences, would ever even think about this. You're telling somebody about something, you're giving somebody an insight into what it's like to do science that is unique. And it did very well. It was very popular on our site. So it's hard to say exactly what a pitch should say, but if it is surprising, enlightening, inspiring, infuriating, any of those things makes it a better pitch. And if it has to do with your own personal experience, that's so much the better. I remember I had another one from a grad student, I think, who talked about her experience doing an experiment and getting a null result, and talking to her PI, who said, "Oh yeah, well, forget it. Let's just do something else." And she said, but isn't this important? Isn't it important to know that there was a null result for this thing that we were looking for? And she talked about how she wishes that null results were given more attention. That was also a great piece. Non-scientists never think about that stuff. Why would learning nothing be important? I'm going to explain it to you. Another postdoc actually did a kind of a groundbreaking piece of work in studying exoplanets. She discovered a pattern.
Mike, sorry to interrupt you, but I think you shifted your computer and the sound just dropped just a little bit. I don't know if it happened for everyone, but can you?
Yeah. How's that? Because I didn't. Can you
I
hear
think
me?
maybe, I don't know, maybe you covered where your microphone is.
I don't. And it's still like that?
We can hear you, it's just low and my sound's all the way up. So I think we can still hear you.
Yeah, well, I hate to do this, but I wonder how to turn my mic. Maybe I can, audio settings. Output level is not very high. What's going on? Well, I'm not sure what's going on.
Well, I hate to inconvenience you, but can you talk loudly?
Sure, but I'm going to, everybody else in the house doesn't. Here. Okay, better? Oh yeah, so this woman had, and it's funny, I had interviewed her when she was an undergraduate for a book I was doing about the search for planets like Earth around other stars, and she was just getting into the field, and I wanted her insight. I was mostly interviewing, senior people, but it was really interesting to hear an undergrad talk about why she was interested in this field. 5 or 8 years later, she comes out with a really important result in exoplanet research, which showed a hitherto unsuspected pattern in solar systems, which is that, in our solar system, we've got big planets like Jupiter and Saturn. We've got small planets like Earth and Mars and Venus. And we've always assumed that most solar systems would be like that too. And what she discovered is that, in fact, most solar systems either have a bunch of big planets or a bunch of small planets and not a mixture, which is crazy and really important. And so she wrote an essay for me about this discovery and how it happened and how surprised she was and what the significance is. So that's another kind of thing. So if you make a major breakthrough, I want to hear from you.
Can you mention a few, like if somebody sends you a pitch and it has that really exciting sentence, that's great. But is there anything else that you want to see in that email?
So I want to see, who you are, because Scientific American built its reputation on bringing the voices of scientists directly to readers. So we do have conventional reported stories where journalists interview scientists, but a lot of our feature stories are written by the scientists themselves. Here's what's going on in my field that's new and exciting. And the same is true in our op-eds. I mostly want to hear from, in fact, I almost entirely want to hear from scientists who have expert insight at whatever level you are, but expert insight, not just a reporter who goes out and learns stuff and tells people about it. That's different. And I see a question in the chat, and it sort of goes to this very point. Do I recommend having already interviewed someone before pitching? I'm not looking for you to interview people. I'm looking for you to tell me about your own experience, your own insight. Interviews, that's for a feature or for a news story. That's not for me. But what I do want to see is your expertise. I want to see a couple of sentences that talk about why this is interesting. I remember I got a pitch last year from a woman who has been doing research, and this is going to be vague because I don't remember it precisely, but doing research on the interactions between scavengers in someplace exotic. And she was studying vultures and jackals and how they sort of negotiate who gets to eat the carcass. And again, that was fascinating. It's her own research. Ordinary people don't really think about that kind of thing. How do two different species figure out how to live in harmony when they're both trying to eat the same, dead zebra? I thought it was surprising and insightful and worth hearing about. Are there? Yeah. Okay. So another question in the margin here. Are there differences in the process for pitching writing for a magazine versus a book? Well, again, it depends on what you're pitching to a magazine. Are you pitching a reported story? Are you pitching a reported news story? Are you pitching a reported feature story? Those are very different. Feature is much longer, and it has to be more comprehensive. So a news story talks about a new result. This was just published in Nature, this paper. Then it shows that the glaciers on the Ross ice shelf are melting faster than we thought. That's a news story. And so you talk about what the paper said and how they figured it out, and get a couple of comments from other scientists who say, oh, this is brilliant work, or who say, well, I'm suspicious, they never actually went there, they're just whatever. A feature story requires you to talk about a broader area of scientific research. So for example, you might write a feature story about the question of whether Antarctica is losing mass or not. And here are all the different, it's a big question. Is it building up in the center faster than it's melting in the margins? That's good news for sea level rise. Is it the opposite? That's bad news. And we still don't know for sure. And here's what we do know, and here's how we know it. And here's all the latest research that's putting together a sort of a picture of how this is going. So that's a feature story. I don't deal with any of those. I only deal with those opinion pieces or those personal essays. But to answer the question, the difference in the process between pitching a magazine versus a book, a book proposal has to be much longer, much more detailed. You have to, in a book proposal, you have to talk about what you want to write about, what the issues are that you're going to tackle. You have to give a list of chapters that you're going to write and what each one will be about. You have to talk at some length about your expertise and your qualification to do this. Completely different process. And book pitching, I've done it, but I haven't done it recently. So I would have to go back and look at some of my proposals to remind myself of, it's a real pain in the neck, a book proposal. A feature story proposal could be a page long. A book proposal is like 20 or 25 or 30 pages long. Okay, another, oh good, the questions are coming in from Joe. Joe, don't you know the answer to this? Can you only pitch your own research, or can you use your expertise to talk about someone else's? And the answer is yes. Yes to the latter. I had a woman write to me whose field I don't totally recall, but some people that she knew in the adjacent lab had received a hair sample from, I can't remember who it was, and they wanted the scientists to test it to see if it was basically if it was Bigfoot, because it was found in the Pacific Northwest and it looked suspicious, and somehow they convinced these scientists to test this to see if it was Bigfoot or just, a bear or something like that. And this woman was not in the lab, she was not actually doing the research, but she was knowledgeable about the field. Her friends were working on this, and she wrote a blog post for me about this crazy thing that happened in the lab next door. That's perfectly fine. It was not Bigfoot, by the way. If someone has written for an editor and then pitches a different story later, do the metrics of the first story factor in to the decision to work with that writer again? Not necessarily. We do care about metrics, but what makes a story take off as opposed to what makes it fall flat with readers is not always clear. We had a story come in a month ago or so talking about the International Space Station as a vital springboard to exploring the solar system. I think it was something like that, or it was vital to our national interest. I don't remember what it was, but I've read a million stories about the International Space Station, and this was actually written by somebody from the United States Chamber of Commerce, which seemed a little odd, but they're worried about commerce and and products that will boost our economy. So they had expertise in the way I define it, and this person was part of their space liaison group or something. And I thought, okay, very nice. I'm sure I've read a dozen like this before. The thing went off the charts with how many people clicked on it. And I'm not to this day sure why. We were all surprised. Maybe it's because they have a huge Twitter following and they got everybody who, all the business people to click on it. I don't know. So the answer is no. If you wrote a story that I think was a good story, or an essay that I thought was a good essay, and it fell flat, that does not stop me from commissioning another one from you. I had one that came in that I thought was just terrific, and basically it did nothing. So no. How do I deal with receiving controversial information from my interviewee? Again, I don't interview people. So, and you don't interview people either if you're talking to me, if you're pitching to me. But if you receive controversial information, you absolutely check it out with another source, an independent source, a reliable independent source. And you check it out anyway if you're doing an interview for a news story, because I had an incident a number of years ago where this is in my writing days, and somebody had just done, one of the things we worry about with climate change is that methane that's trapped under the continental shelves of the Arctic Ocean will start to be released as the ocean warms up. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and if enough of it is released, that could turbocharge global warming. So it's something people wonder about. And this scientist had gone on an expedition to measure how much methane is coming out of the Arctic Ocean. And she found, oh, there's methane coming out. And so this got a lot of attention. It's a big deal. Is this starting to happen? Are we doomed? And I interviewed the scientist, and she explained what they did and what they learned and what the consequences could be. But I also got in touch with an independent scientist to say, well, here's this paper. What do you think about it? And he said something that, since I'm not a scientist, didn't necessarily occur to me. He said, this is a really important paper. It's a really important measurement, but it doesn't tell us anything at all. We've never tried to measure this before. So we have no idea if this is the amount of methane that has been coming out steadily for the last 10,000 years and is perfectly normal, or whether it is increasing. It's just a baseline. If we go out and measure it again in a couple of years, then we'll know something, or then we'll know at least something. And so I had that important caveat to put in my story. I wouldn't have had it otherwise. So that wasn't something controversial. It was just that the scientist hadn't thought to tell me something that was obvious to her, but another scientist did. But if there's something controversial, you absolutely need to check it with somebody who is not involved in the research and who has some sort of legitimate expertise and some sort of track record. The average turnaround time, another question, average turnaround time from pitch to product, I guess you mean to publication, very hard to say. If it is a reaction to something that just happened and is making a lot of news, the turnaround time will be extremely turnaround time will be extremely short, because we want to take advantage of the fact that everybody's talking about this. We want to be in that conversation. If it's something that
Mike, can you give us an idea of what extremely short means? Just because in academia, extremely short could be a 2-week deadline.
So if some, if hypothetically, if President Trump should announce that he's barring anybody from an Islamic majority country from entering the U.S., I want to hear from a Muslim scientist immediately. I want to get, if I can, I want to post something today or tomorrow, which many scientists simply can't do. They just are not accustomed to those things. Somebody wrote, I have an example, but I have to remember what it is. I don't know if it's something that was relatively recent, but that about which the hubbub has dried away, I don't mind waiting a couple of weeks. If it's something that we could do anytime. So the woman who wrote about the vultures and the jackals, we actually have a pretty big stream of pieces coming through my section. Our copy editors are chronically overbooked. I've got some stuff sitting with the copy editors that I've done with, but then they have to go over it for, to make it conform to house style, to raise questions about things that aren't clear. I've had stuff sitting with them for literally 2 weeks because there's simply no urgency. It's a story that can be published at any time. If we publish it 6 months from, in fact, I will get pitches from people who say, "What's the deadline? When do you need this by?" And the answer, honestly, is I don't care. Turn it in 6 months from now. It will be just as interesting then, just as valid then. The woman who talked about peeing in the Arctic. And I should tell you, in response to that blog post, I got another one from another woman who works in the Arctic saying, that post inspired me to write about an issue that I have. I've got a newborn at home. I'm out doing field work. Pumping breast milk at 50 below zero in gale force winds is not as easy as you might think, or maybe it's even harder than you might think. So that was another one that I thought was great. But again, that would have been fine 6 months later. I got it in within a few weeks just because I had an opening, but it really depends on how timely and urgent something is and how much we want to capitalize on it. When the last episode of Game of Thrones aired, one of our bloggers, or actually one of our print columnists, weighed in with a sociological interpretation of why some fans were disappointed with the last season of Game of Thrones. And the last show was airing on, I think, a Sunday, and she turned it in on a Thursday, and we had that on this website by Friday because we knew this was, if you waited till after the show was over, we would lose many readers. And that literally got 1 million hits, which is very unusual for us. So timeliness makes a big difference.
I think Karen has another question.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. You talked about publishing negative result and how that became an essay earlier. And as a scientist, I wouldn't immediately think that that's something that is interesting. So how do you identify, if you have a tip on how scientists should identify a topic that would be appealing to the average reader?
That is a very difficult thing to say. And the reason it's difficult is that I am not a scientist myself. I am an average reader, although I'm obviously much more knowledgeable than the average reader because I've been doing this for decades and have written about many, many topics, and especially if it's in astrophysics. By the way, I should just tell you that I was invited 20 years later when I was at Time Magazine to be on the visiting advisory committee for the astrophysics department that I flunked out of, because they thought and they knew that I'd flunked out, but they thought as a journalist who covers these things, I would have some unusual insights. It's very hard to say. The only guide. So if I know it when I see it, but giving a definition is really tough. The only guidance I think I can give you is that you are a scientist. You all are scientists. You presumably talk to non-scientists sometimes. They presumably ask you about what you're doing, and you presumably have had the experience of people being genuinely interested versus people being kind of baffled or not very interested. And you have to reach into yourself to look at those examples to get a sense of, you talk to your parents, you talk to your siblings, you talk to your hairdresser, you talk to your auto mechanic, maybe, I don't know, but you talk to your friends in other fields. What do they respond to? And yeah, I wish there were a prescription. I can send Burley some guidelines that we have on our website that maybe give a bit of an insight into that, but it's not comprehensive. And it's funny, as a journalist, I have, for those neuroscientists out there, you're not probably aware of this, but there is a journalism region of the brain, which will become larger with use, just like the hippocampus does, I guess. And there are more connections in it. And it's constantly operating in the background for me. So as I navigate the world, if somebody says something to me, or I read something, or I hear something, that brain region lights up and says, hey, that's a story. So for example, I was at Georgia Tech giving a talk, and I was being shown around some of the mechanical engineering labs. People were doing bioengineering. And a woman talked to me about her experiments in seeing how much you can squeeze some kind of insect before it is crushed. I thought, well, why would you do that? And she said, well, there are these insects get into, for example, grain silos, and the question is, are they going to live, or are they not going to live? And it makes a difference to people who process grain. They want to know how to deal with these insects. I'm getting the details wrong, but literally she does experiments where she puts insects into a cylinder and puts pressure on until they break. Nobody would imagine that somebody does stuff like this, but they do. And it's really surprising and fascinating, and it's scientifically valid, but it seems crazy that somebody would do something like that. And as soon as she was talking, my brain lit up, and I said, that's a piece I want to get. And I'm kind of annoyed she hasn't turned it in yet.
So I think we're pretty close to being out of time, but we started a little bit late. So unless anyone has any final questions, I thought maybe we could end on, if you could give us a few bullet points on what absolutely not to do when pitching an editor, or if there's something that really annoys you or would get you to ignore, or just flat out say no.
What not to do is to pitch something about which you have no actual expertise. That is a big turnoff. Pitching something that in which you list a bunch of facts in a sort of a dull and unexciting way, as with that example I gave you. And I don't necessarily have the time to respond in detail to bad pitches, to explain why they're bad. This was another person sort of in your position, part of a group that does gets together for conferences on science communication and how to write for the public. And then they pitch to me because I've agreed to accept them. There's a bunch of groups like you out there, in fact, and maybe there's some overlap. And I felt, in my mentorship role, which I take very seriously because I also teach at Princeton, I felt, I really owe it to this person to explain why this isn't working. And to my delight, she responded, so I completely turned it around. What else? If something is much too technical, that's absolutely going to be a turnoff to me. If I can't pretty quickly see, oh, I see what you're talking about, and I get a sense of why this is important, and then I'm not going to have a lot of patience with it. As I said early on, a pitch that talks about the fact that I'm working on this receptor and this pathway and the neurotransmitter and the A24 gene and it's just my eyes glaze over, as a reader's would. I need something in as plain language as you can make it that makes it clear why people should be interested. That works. Something that does not do that generally does not work. This all feels very vague. It's when I first started teaching, I'd been a journalist for about 15 or 20 years, and I realized that I just do what I do. How do you write a story? Well, you report it and then you write it. And if it's not working, then you rewrite it. But that wouldn't take up a whole semester. I had to start understanding how I do what I do. And it's still not so easy to explain because it has become instinctual, which is in fact a problem for scientists. They have an instinct. They are trained to be able to talk to each other in the proper language. And many of them literally seem to forget what it's like to talk about science to an ordinary person. So you have to try and get yourself in that mindset. Don't tell me about something as you would tell it to your person at the next bench in the lab, or some of your cohort in grad school. Tell me about it as you would tell your friend who's an English major or something else. That's the key to getting my attention, and it's very frustrating when I have to weed through jargon to try and figure out what this person is talking about. And you need to make it clear why this is important, or why it's important to you, why it fascinates you. Why do you love what you do? That's another one, because people think of scientists as a different species who talk differently and think differently and aren't really like regular people. And in fact, to their surprise, they will often find out, oh, they actually are like regular people. They do things that regular people do, and they are capable of talking to regular people. And that's what you need to try and do.
All right. We're a little bit past time. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. The recording will be up in the next few days. And Mike, if you send me the guidelines for writing for Scientific American, I can also post that in the Mentor channel.
Okay. Oh, and I'm getting some thanks in the right hand. I think it could have been clearer, but I appreciate your kindness.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good day.
That was great. That was really good. Bye.